In the intricate tapestry of modern life, few threads are woven more deeply into the psyche of the middle class than real estate. Home ownership has long been a symbol of stability, achievement, and security, a benchmark by which many measure their success. For generations, it has stood as both a milestone and an anchor, offering a place to grow families, build wealth, and plant roots in a community. But what happens when that symbol fractures? What becomes of the psychological fabric of the middle class when the very ground beneath them, figuratively and financially, collapses? A major crash in the real estate market is no longer a hypothetical. Warning signs are flashing across both residential and commercial sectors globally. Rising interest rates, inflationary pressure, increased debt servicing costs, stagnating wages, and structural shifts in work and consumer behavior are converging in what some economists describe as a perfect storm. While the headlines may focus on property values, foreclosure statistics, and investor losses, the silent, looming catastrophe lies elsewhere, in the minds and hearts of those who will suffer the most. This video aims to explore a largely neglected dimension of economic crises, mental health. Specifically, it will delve into how a significant crash in the real estate market could affect the mental well-being of the middle class, the demographic most emotionally and financially invested in the idea of property ownership. This is not merely an economic analysis, it is a human one. The middle class, once considered the backbone of stable economies, is under siege. Over the last 2 decades, the aspirational model has been eroded by stagnant wages, shrinking social mobility, and rising costs of living. In this context, real estate has often served as the last bastion of financial hope. A family home isn't just a physical asset, it is a psychological fortress. Losing it, or even watching its value plummet, can trigger a cascade of emotional, behavioral, and relational consequences that ripple through communities and across generations. The mental health implications of a real estate crash are profound and multifaceted. At the individual level, homeowners may experience anxiety, depression, shame, and chronic stress. Marriages may strain or dissolve under financial pressure. Children raised in unstable housing conditions may face developmental and emotional challenges. At a broader level, community well-being may degrade as social services are strained, homelessness rises, and trust in institutions erodes. But this looming crisis also presents an opportunity, a moment to rethink how societies value, regulate, and support housing as a human right rather than a speculative commodity. It is a chance to reimagine public policy, financial systems, and mental health services in ways that buffer against future shocks and protect human dignity in times of instability. In the following episodes, this video will unpack the psychological toll of real estate collapse on the middle class. It will examine the cultural myths surrounding home ownership, the financial mechanisms that exacerbate housing crises, and the emotional architecture of stability and loss. Through research, case studies, and speculative foresight, it will illuminate a path forward, one that not only mitigates damage but builds resilience. A crash in the real estate market may shake the foundations of modern economies, but the real fault lines will be revealed in the mental health of those left standing in the rubble. This is a story not just of lost equity, but of broken dreams, disillusioned hopes, and the urgent need for compassionate, systemic intervention. For decades, home ownership has stood as the crown jewel of the middle-class identity. It represents far more than bricks and mortar. It is the culmination of aspiration, labor, and sacrifice, the reward for playing by the rules of society. It's a space of self-definition, familial memory, and intergenerational wealth. Yet beneath the romantic narrative lies a more fragile reality. The dream of home ownership has become increasingly tenuous, even before the threat of a market crash looms on the horizon. Historically, middle-class status has been synonymous with certain milestones: stable employment, access to education, home ownership, and the ability to save for retirement. These pillars created a sense of security and predictability in life's trajectory. But over time, the link between hard work and housing security has frayed. Skyrocketing home prices, disproportionate to wage growth, have stretched middle-class budgets to the breaking point. The once sturdy dream is now accessible only through excessive leverage, risky mortgages, and an over-reliance on a continuously appreciating market. Many families have overextended themselves to secure a place in the housing market, convinced that real estate is the safest path to wealth and stability. In doing so, they have become financially vulnerable to the very asset they believed would protect them. The psychological investment in this dream cannot be overstated. It informs how people see themselves and their success in life. Owning a home isn't just economic, it's existential. For middle-class individuals, especially those who are first-generation homeowners or who grew up in rental housing, buying a home is often accompanied by a deep emotional sense of arrival. The house becomes a symbol of having made it. It's where life unfolds. Birthdays, graduations, quiet Sunday mornings, arguments, reconciliations, and every moment in between. It represents permanence in a transient world. The emotional toll becomes even more pronounced when societal narratives about home ownership, often presented as moral achievements, collide with economic realities. Those who lose their homes may not only feel the weight of failure, but also the sting of shame. They internalize systemic failure as personal incompetence, and this can lead to long-term mental health challenges, including depression, anxiety disorders, and a loss of trust in social systems. There is a generational element to this fragility. Baby boomers and many Gen X homeowners purchased properties in a different economic climate, when home prices were more proportionate to income and job security was more attainable. Today, younger generations face a starkly different landscape. Millennials and Gen Z are often burdened with student debt, precarious work arrangements, and historically high housing prices. When they do manage to enter the market, it's frequently with the help of parental wealth or by stretching their finances to unsustainable levels. This creates a dual burden: the pressure to uphold the middle class standard their parents enjoyed, and the emotional labor of navigating a system that no longer rewards the same behaviors. A crash would not only crush those struggling to maintain ownership, but also those who sacrificed greatly to achieve it. The psychic wound is sharpened by the generational disconnect between what was once possible and what is now at risk. While the very wealthy may have diversified portfolios to buffer against a housing collapse, and lower-income renters may already be accustomed to housing precarity, the middle class stands as the emotional epicenter of this potential disaster. They are the ones most likely to have their self-concept and life plans wrapped up in home ownership. The idea of home ownership as a stabilizing force in middle-class life is built on a foundation that's increasingly fragile. As housing markets inflate beyond reason and policy decisions continue to favor speculative capital over human need, the middle class walks a perilous tightrope. If the balance is lost and a crash occurs, the fall will not just be measured in financial loss, but in psychological upheaval. Understanding this emotional framework is essential. It lays the groundwork for the chapters that follow, which will explore not only the mechanisms of the crash, but the cascading effects on mental health, relationships, community cohesion, and the wider social contract. The anatomy of a real estate crash is rarely simple. It is not the result of a single failure, but rather a convergence of pressures: economic, political, social, and psychological. In order to fully grasp the mental health implications of such a collapse, it is necessary to first understand the underlying mechanisms that would bring about such a crash in the first place. Only then can we appreciate the true extent of its reach, not just as an economic event, but as a seismic social and emotional rupture. One of the most significant contributing factors to both housing bubbles and their eventual collapse is central bank monetary policy. For much of the 2010s and early 2020s, historically low interest rates incentivized borrowing and made mortgage payments appear deceptively affordable. These conditions fueled a surge in home buying, investor speculation, and property development, all under the assumption that the cost of debt would remain cheap indefinitely. However, once inflation began to rise, driven by supply chain disruptions, pandemic-era stimulus, energy shocks, and wage pressures, central banks responded by aggressively raising interest rates. This shift dramatically increased the cost of mortgage repayments, pushing many households to their financial limits. Adjustable-rate mortgages, popular during the low-rate period, became ticking time bombs. For the middle class, whose budgets are often finely balanced, these rate hikes can be catastrophic. Higher rates not only increase monthly housing costs, but also suppress demand, reducing property values. As prices drop and equity evaporates, those who borrowed heavily may find themselves in negative equity, owing more on their mortgages than their homes are worth. This financial inversion is both an economic problem and a deep psychological wound, as the perceived value of hardened investments disintegrates. Over the past 2 decades, housing has increasingly been treated not as shelter, but as an investment vehicle. Large institutional investors, including private equity firms and pension funds, have entered the residential real estate market in search of stable returns. This has driven up prices, often beyond the reach of ordinary buyers. At the same time, house flipping culture and the rise of short-term rental platforms like Airbnb have further inflated prices in desirable areas. The middle class, watching others build wealth through property, often followed suit, buying second homes, investing in rental units, or stretching themselves thin to purchase in hot markets. This speculative environment created a fragile ecosystem where value was determined not by utility or affordability, but by belief in perpetual appreciation. It set the stage for a bubble of epic proportions. When belief in that system begins to falter, when headlines about price drops replace tales of bidding wars, a psychological chain reaction begins. Confidence turns to doubt, then to fear, and finally to panic. The market becomes a self-reinforcing downward spiral. As prices fall, more people try to sell, exacerbating the decline. For homeowners who saw their property as their primary asset, this can feel like watching their life savings burn in slow motion. At the heart of the housing crisis lies a fundamental mismatch between earnings and costs. In many major urban centers, housing prices have outpaced wage growth for years. While prices soared, real wages stagnated, creating a situation where even relatively well-paid professionals struggle to afford basic housing. To bridge this gap, households increasingly turn to debt. Credit cards, personal loans, student loans, and auto financing all added layers of financial pressure. For middle-class families already juggling multiple obligations, the sudden impact of a housing downturn, whether through job loss, increased repayments, or declining asset value, can become the tipping point that pushes them into crisis. This is especially dangerous because the middle class often lacks access to the safety nets available to lower-income groups, such as housing benefits or subsidized public housing. Simultaneously, they lack the liquidity and financial expertise of wealthier groups who can weather downturns more easily. The result is a unique kind of precarity, hidden beneath the surface, unrecognized by policy, and devastating when exposed. The COVID-19 pandemic profoundly altered housing patterns, particularly with the rise of remote work. Suddenly, location was no longer tied to employment, prompting an exodus from expensive urban centers to suburban and rural areas. This created massive distortions in local housing markets, with prices in smaller towns and rural communities rising dramatically as demand outstripped supply. Now, as remote work policies evolve and some companies demand a return to the office, the long-term sustainability of these shifts is being called into question. In some regions, this may lead to declining values in newly hot markets, while urban areas struggle with commercial vacancies and declining tax revenues. These geographic imbalances further complicate an already volatile housing landscape. For middle-class families who relocated in search of affordable housing or a better quality of life, the collapse of these markets could be devastating. Not only would they face financial loss, but also the emotional turmoil of uprooting again, dealing with under-resourced local services, or feeling stranded in communities that no longer offer the value they promised. Perhaps most tragically, the looming real estate collapse is not just the result of market forces, but of systemic political failure. Housing policy in many countries has long been captured by interests that prioritize profit over people. Zoning laws limit supply, subsidies benefit the already wealthy, and regulatory capture ensures that meaningful reform remains out of reach. When the crash comes, these structural problems will not disappear, they will intensify. Middle-class homeowners will look to their governments for relief, only to find bureaucracy, inefficiency, or outright neglect. The disillusionment this breeds will not be limited to housing. It will undermine faith in democracy, social contracts, and institutional legitimacy itself. This erosion of trust is profoundly damaging to mental health. When people believe that society no longer works for them, that their suffering is invisible or ignored, they are more likely to experience despair, alienation, and anger. These emotions don't just fester individually, they become socially contagious, weakening the collective fabric of civic life. A real estate crash is not a singular event. It is a cascading failure that unfolds in waves. Each wave brings new trauma. First, the anxiety of declining value, then the stress of rising costs, the grief of foreclosure or forced relocation, and finally the disorientation of a future that no longer looks like the one that was promised. For the middle class, who built their identities around the stability and security of home ownership, this is nothing short of a psychological earthquake. In the next episode, we will explore how these economic shocks translate into psychosocial consequences, how the collapse of financial stability can manifest in anxiety, depression, breakdowns in relationships, and a growing public health crisis that few are prepared to confront.